for example, as China became as successful as it has become, the United States turned absolutely hostile to its free market ideology. So it started to recognize in 2010 something's going wrong. This is not what we want. We want a subservient China, not a successful China. Now we have to, quote, contain China. And I think that that's the skill. The skill is not to have a state governed by private companies, but also not to kill the private companies and their capacity to innovate. And I think China has done the best of this of all the major economies in the last 40 years.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this second webinar, where we are very pleased to have Radhika Desai with us, a political economist and political scientist at the University of Manitoba, right? And Radhika, I will let you do the introduction about yourself, and then please also, of course, about your analysis of world affairs.
Sure. So yeah, I'm basically a professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba, but I've always done politics in combination with political economy. And then in 2013, I published a book called Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, in which I proposed a very different way of looking at world affairs, because none of the dominant approaches in international relations or in international political economy can really help us make sense of the world in which we live today. And so what I'll do is I'll just try to give you a flavor of my understanding. So let's take them very quickly, one by one. Realism, of course, to me, it has always, this idea that all countries will be equally aggressive militarily and they are all seeking to expand power, has always been a cover for understanding U.S. aggression, U.S. expansionism, etc., etc. Nor can it really explain why so many of the problems today emanate exclusively from the United States. Nor can it explain why, if you actually look at it, the behavior of countries like the Soviet Union or China, which are not capitalist, has in fact been largely defensive. It has not been aggressive in the same way as the US has been. So realism does not work. And it's also a bit of my favorite joke these days is that realism, because it has this notion of national self-interest, which is completely, it does not correspond to anything that motivates foreign policy. So, the states pursue their national interest. But since this does not work, because the national interest is kind of the interest of, say, in the case of the United States, all Americans, whereas, of course, US foreign policy is not animated by the interests of all Americans. It is animated by the interests of a corporate elite. So, my argument has been, that it's not that the US is hegemonic, not that the US is once hegemonic and is now declining, but that the US was never hegemonic. So though in the early 20th century, it began to nurse an ambition, witness to the power of a decline in the power of the UK, it began to nurse the ambition, in the words of one historian, to replace the Britain as the managing segment of the world economy. It never succeeded. Indeed, back then, it also whittled down the ambition. By the early 20th century, warfare was already so costly, expensive, deadly. On top of that, of course, the world had already been divided up by the old imperialist powers. So they were quite explicit. They were not concerned to acquire an empire comparable to Britain's. That was not, would not be possible, and this should not be tried. But they would settle for making the dollar the world's money, and so this still. And my argument is that even this whittled down ambition did not succeed, because the dollar essentially was already problematic before 1971. And imperialism, so geopolitical economy places imperialism at the heart of understanding international relations, which, you can take our international relations anywhere in the world, but they will not talk about imperialism as being central, but that is what is central. Now, imperialism requires two sets of things from the subordinated periphery. Capitalist countries require two sets of things. Number one, they require, of course, the subordinated periphery to accept its excess commodities and to accept excess capital. And on the other side, it requires from the subordinated periphery cheap goods and cheap labor. But these two sets of needs are contradictory because on the one hand, the periphery needs to be prosperous and stable enough to accept excess commodities and excess capital, and it needs to be poor enough to yield up its raw materials, its intermediate goods, its wage goods cheaply to the imperialist countries. So essentially, what I want to argue is that in this context, what we are so neoliberalism is adopted as the way out of the crisis, but neoliberalism itself is ultimately, in my view, one of the biggest frauds. I mean, neoclassical economics, because neoclassical economics has very little to say about monopoly. Even though it is born at a time when capitalism has become monopoly. It talks about competition, it talks about free markets, but when you give freedom to a senile monopoly capitalism, what you are not going to get the restoration of the growth dynamic, which is what we were told would happen if you gave capital more freedoms, as it was given in the last 45 years. What you get is the increasing demonstration or increasing manifestation of the vices of monopoly, rentierism, lack of investment, slow growth, financialization above all.
Then let's open the floor, and maybe can I ask Jeffrey, the other economist on our panel, to maybe give your thoughts and questions?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Radhika. And it's very stimulating, and I like very much parts of it, and other parts I have both questions and somewhat disagreements with. I really like your your statement that realism is really a theory about U.S. aggression, because I think that this is actually in its deep sense, realism is a theory about British and American behavior. It is not a universal theory. And it says countries are just inherently violent because they are inherently violent, both the British and the Americans. And so it's a kind of projection of how the U.S. behaves to say that inevitably there will be violence, therefore we will be violent. So I agree. I agree very much with this. I'm not sure about some of the other definitions. I agree also with your critique very much. I think it's vital of the hegemonic stability theory, because this is a claim that only a hegemon can provide a global order. So we need a Pax Britannica or a Pax Americana or chaos. And I agree completely with that. It's very self-serving if you happen to be the hegemon to say that it's you or the deluge and that there's nothing else afterwards. And I think it is demonstrably false. I'm not sure about definitions of liberalism, whether it is taken to mean that states disappear. And I'm a little bit, I actually am rather fundamentally more optimistic about the role of international markets in helping what I would say is a broad phenomenon of catching up economic growth. So markets don't work when they are absolutely managed by a dominant power for the sake of extraction. They could be called markets, but it's a form of extraction. And that's what imperialism is, after all. You don't expect your colony to develop. You extract from your colony. And we need a clear theory of imperialism as an economic phenomenon, not only as a political phenomenon, to understand how the extraction works and what the imperial power does. And so if you observe during the period of imperialism that colonies did not grow, to my mind, that's not a contradiction to the idea that markets internationally can be a mechanism for growth. It's a reflection of the very purpose of imperialism, which is extraction. And extraction works in a number of ways. You don't build industry locally. You don't educate the population locally. You make sure that there are not mechanisms where your colony is going to become so self-aware and so powerful that it kicks out the imperial power. And so in that sense, markets are no guarantee. They're not even markets, really, but they look like markets. They're managed by companies. There's trade. But it's not really the only kind of market. And markets aren't inherently exploitative. It depends on their structure and management. I believe, for example, that China's growth after 1980 depended heavily on international markets, and that there was a benign period of about 30 years where the United States, either out of naivete or ideology or the interests of the corporate class, which was making a lot of money on investing in China, enabled China to have export-led growth. And without that, it would have been very hard to do within China itself. And I think, broadly speaking, again, and I'm generalizing over 1,000 caveats and footnotes and so forth, Japan's industrialization at the end of the 19th century, which was it turned into a militaristic, imperial, and even fascistic industrialization, was in some important sense supported by external markets from the Meiji Restoration onward. Japan's recovery after the 1950s, which was under a U.S. security umbrella, similarly with the so-called Asian tigers, which was, again, to an important extent in a very supportive U.S. security environment, was really export-led growth in an important way and enabled specialization, upgrading technology, doing all the things that it's supposed to do. So I don't want to dismiss the idea of specialization, markets, trade, but I also absolutely agree that they come in many varieties and forms, and they can be completely exploitative. They can be a veneer of power. They can be a reality of growth. And for example, as China became as successful as it has become, the United States turned absolutely hostile to its free market ideology. So it started to recognize in 2010 something's going wrong. This is not what we want. We want a subservient China, not a successful China. Now we have to, quote, contain China. And so the supposed free market ideology turned out to be a thin veneer once it was realized that this was a threat to U.S. Delusional hegemony, I'll say. And one more point that I would disagree with, which is when you describe the world as multipolar in even 1910, I think you said, or around then. It was European imperial, I would say. Of course, we don't disagree on that, so I would just use the word differently. From my dating, the way I date things, the period from 1750 to 1950 was the European imperial age. I think it was incredibly nasty, incredibly vulgar, incredibly destructive, and that the middle period, 1910, was a competition of empires in Europe, but I would not call that multipolar. I would call it intra-European competition. But what I like about multipolarity today, and maybe this is just semantic, but just to clarify, that there really is a China, there's an India, there's a Russia that are absolutely thumbing their nose at the United States and saying, we're not part of your system. And that's, for me, multipolarity. The Western dominance was the age of Western imperialism, and in some sense, it ended at the end of World War II. with the United States becoming an empire of a different sort, of course, but with enough sovereignty in India and China and other places that they could achieve a development outside of the U.S. Security state. So not as vassals as the United States assumed they would be. The other thing I would say, just in terms of again, this is kind of classification and language. I would not say that all countries have, if I heard you right, but maybe I didn't, have had socialist industrialization. That have industrialized. The idea of a free market economy is a comic book, and always has been a comic book. Even in the height of free market ideology of Britain in 1850, of course, the East India Company was not a free market. It was a private army backed by a public army. And so there's never been, and I think Polanyi made the point, though there was claims and maybe even aspirations and ideologies of free markets. It's impossible. And no one would live in such a ghastly society, and nor could it actually be imposed. And it's also true that there's industrialization, period, always has been both private capital and public power together in many ways. So there's never a pure market system. But there's a difference, really a difference, of the Soviet Union in its heyday and Japan, for example. Japan was private capital in a one-state system, but it was private capital. And China has a lot of private capital. It's got a lot of state capital, too. The Soviet Union really was an excess. It was the idea that it would be state ownership and state planning, period. Whereas all successful countries, I'll say, are mixed systems of state and private, and that one is a cartoon to say it's all private. That's never been the case. And on the other hand, although in good Marxian view, which I believe in, the state may be the handmaiden of the private capital, but you still need the state to build the infrastructure, to provide the naval power and other things. So it's a mixed system. Whereas the attempt of the Soviet Union, which I happened to witness firsthand, of doing it all, because they really did in the end by accident go to an all-state system, was not a great success. It really was a mess by the end. And so I'm a believer in a mixed economy. I rather like Gershon Krohn's observation in 1952 that the later you come, the more you need the state to protect you from the outside predation of existing power and to catch up faster. And I think that was a really smart observation of Gershon Krohn, that you get more state later, partly because you understand, Britain really did stumble along in gradual development for a century and a half. Of course, the state was always there, but it was 2% growth. Whereas if you want to grow at 5 or 10%, you really need the state for sure to achieve 5 to 10% state growth. So I rather use the mixed economy idea that we need that, and that all successful development is mixed economy. Then I'm a cosmopolitan, so I just want to take on that issue before I turn it back over to you, which is, I don't believe that nations go away, of course. This is, you'd have to be a fool. And I don't believe that nations or cultures or localities or ethnicities don't matter, of course. But I do believe in this idea of subsidiarity and governance at all scales. So I like the UN. I like regional bodies. I like national bodies. I like local bodies. I do not want the UN running my school system or paving my road. On the other hand, I don't want the nation state to decide on climate change. I would rather have a supranational framework in which we are trying to fix the atmosphere of the planet as a whole. So in that sense, I believe that what we should be always describing in a constructive in a constructive approach or a normative approach is that we need governance at all levels. And I like the subsidiarity idea, which is leave it closest to the local level that is feasible with the success. But when it comes to nuclear arms, the oceans, space, climate, I want a UN. And so I want to make sure that we have that. I'm not sure I understand. I mean, there's a phrase that's used every day that I don't mean it just in an argumentative sense. I literally don't know what people mean about the globe, that they hate the globalists or the globalist critique, because this is part of both left and right. In one sense, I'm a globalist because I work for the UN every day without pay, but I work for the UN every day. Because I believe it's absolutely vital. But I'm also a localist too, because most of life is not going to be determined by at a global level, nor should it be. And the attack on globalism seems to mean many, many things. We don't want the UN to tell us what to do. Don't want the UN black helicopters. We don't want the UN imposing LGBTQ on us, which is the right-wing critique. I don't know exactly, but I don't like the term because I don't know if they mean. I think they mean no global governance, which I think is impossible in our interconnected world and would be completely destructive if we went the madman course of Donald Trump. So I think my bottom line is, I think I agree with you on almost everything except maybe definitions, but maybe not. I'm not sure if there are differences that are at the core of this or whether it's categories and language. So let me end there.
Then Radhika, please.
Sure. I mean, you've said so many really interesting things, and I actually think that we may end up at the end of this agreeing that most, if not all, our differences are about terms. So let me just focus. I mean, I'm really glad you like some of what I said, which is
a lot.
Great. And so let me just say that I mean, at one level, let me say I agree with you in very substantially about what you're saying about markets. But it seems to me what you're saying about markets is, you said that the idea of a free market economy, you agree with Polanyi. It's a comic book thing. You agree with Polanyi. Markets always embedded. Great. We are completely agreed on that. So what you're saying is that markets will work provided they are properly managed by states for competition, for, also in terms, serviced by markets in terms of the provision of education, etc. Even industrial policy, you're not averse to that, etc. And of course, List himself was quite clear that the purpose of industrial policy, the purpose of state-directed development would be to enable a given country to go over that initial hump of industrialization, but eventually to join the world market, etc. So I think that, and I'm not necessarily opposed to that, I think free trade is only problematic if one country is producing computers and another country is producing bananas. But if one country is producing computers and another is producing TVs or whatever at an equal technological level, then there's like trade within most of the EU, not all though, because there's also the Germany-Greece type problem. But anyway, you get my point. I mean, so we're fine with that. So I think, the gist of what you're saying, okay, then you said Japan's industrialization was supported by markets. Of course. But also, interestingly, Japan undertook a form of export-led industrialization, which had actually two consequences, interestingly. One is, of course, that it relied on an external market, which then means that you are essentially deindustrializing another part of the world. And also, when you engage in export-led industrialization, you actually don't give a fig about the material living standards of your own working class, because they are not your consumers. And I think that that's my main complaint about export-led industrialization. I think that you have to have a form of industrialization in which, as Henry Ford said, your workers should be able to buy. And, it is interesting that Henry Ford as a phenomenon emerges in this period when the United States, in this early 20th century, when the United States is already coming up against the difficulty of lack of markets. So it is not surprising that, not that I agree with Ford on everything, but, he was a thinking guy in his own way, and he figured this out. So that good for him. Anyway, so that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that, yes, Marx, you see, there is a very interesting interesting relation between markets and planning. Because what is a firm? A firm is planned production. So you have so firms exist as little structures of planned production within markets. But of course, once you get monopoly, more and more of your economy is planned production under the authority of private capitalists. And at that, which is part of what Marx meant, that when you come to monopoly, the country will become ripe for socialism, because if you have planned production, then why leave it under private control? Why not put it under public control? Why not put it under democratic control? Why shouldn't workers take it over? Because it is ridiculous that it should take place under. And of course, when it takes place under the authority of private capital, it can be not only oppressive to workers, but it is also prone to rentierism, etc., etc. So for all of those reasons, there is absolutely no reason. And of course, today, with information and communication technology, what you have is that these companies can plan extremely intricately. We all know about how, Walmart can plan exactly how many bottles of which shampoo need to be on which shelf of which store at what time. They have all these feedback loops of information. Well, you know what? That makes planning more possible in a democratic context. So that we should be able, and there's lots been written about this, which I only know that it has been written, and I know some of it. I haven't done a great study of it, but I think that this fundamental point is correct, that ICT actually enables us to plan better than ever, which is not to say that it is in fact one of the ironies that the Soviet Union disintegrated just when this kind of technology was coming online. I mean, just imagine that the astonishing industrialization was undertaken without availability of such information technology. By the 1930s, the Soviet Union had become the second industrial power in the world. They continued to plan the economy, okay, not perhaps very well, I mean, we've all read our Alec Nov and we know what went wrong and so on, but fine. But they did manage to do a pretty darn good job considering everything. And they gave Soviet citizens a standard of living which was at least roughly comparable to Western levels. And I think that is quite an astonishing achievement. And by the way, one thing I didn't manage to say here is that the form of industrialization that would take place after the early 20th century would have to be fundamentally different, because unless it was taking place under the umbrella of imperialism as it did in South Korea or Taiwan, it would be different in three ways. It would have to, number one, take place from a position to which the country has been set back by imperialism, which is not the case for the European countries. It would have to take place without the privilege of imperialism, because, and this is a long discussion, but essentially the agricultures of these countries would have to pay the price of industrialization, and and there should be a way of managing to do it in a way that anyway, it has led to problems in both China and Russia, as we know. But this is without the privilege of imperialism. And number three, in the teeth of imperialist resistance. So and also one may add one other thing, which is, that they would not have the safety valve of exporting excess populations to the rest of the world, which the Europeans did. So, so in all of these ways, the industrialization and development of the rest of the world would have to be different. Okay, on your point about multipolarity, you are saying that up to 1750 to 1950 is the European imperial age, but it is in this period that the US industrialized, Japan industrialized, two non-European powers. So that, I call it multipolar simply because these guys were competing with one another. But being capitalist powers as they were, their competition had certain consequences. Today's multipolarity will not have the same consequences because the powers that are now emerging are not other capitalist imperialist powers. But that's something else that we can discuss. And this is another reason why you need something like geopolitical economy, because you take seriously the idea that the dynamics of capitalism are the main determinant of foreign policy as far as the imperialist countries are concerned, as far as the successful capitalist countries are concerned. And all the trouble in the world has emanated from one corner, as Glenn calls it, what is it, the peninsula of Asia or whatever it is, it has emerged from this one corner. I agree with you what you said about the East India Company, etc. Polanyi markets are embedded, etc. Although, very interestingly, Polanyi's ideas are always read as if, there is a yo-yo between embedding and disembedding. We will have, free markets and then there'll be a reaction, etc. This double movement. But actually what Polanyi was saying in the Great Transformation, if you think about it, read the first sentence of the Great Transformation. What does he say? 19th century civilization has collapsed. And what he meant by that is that the conditions under which this yo-yo of embedding and disembedding, the double movement, that double movement will not occur. Now, what we need, Polanyi was saying, is we need some kind of socialism. That's what he was saying in 44. I agree with you. Now, on state and market, I will simply say that really it seems to me the issue is, particularly given that markets left to themselves, if they are left to themselves, but even when they are not left to themselves, within a capitalist context, they will lead to monopoly. Then monopoly corporations will dominate the state. Really, the issue is, does the state control the corporations or do the corporations control the state? And to me, once you have the state controlling corporations, you can all sorts of possibilities open up. You can have more or less planning based on the context, the need. You can be quite pragmatic about the boundary between plan and market, etc. And I think I think you probably agree with that. Cosmopolitanism, yeah, okay. And what's wrong with globalism? I actually was allergic to the term globalization, global this, global that, even at the beginning. Like, I said, what's this about? I mean, the states, because you see, the globalists did claim that states have become irrelevant. It was a reassertion of a certain type of cosmopolitanism. Mm-hmm. So I say, what are they talking about? And I also feel, and I used to say globalism is wrong, but now I say that globalism, whatever, it addles your mind. It prevents you from asking the right question. Let me give you a small example. The 2008 financial crisis, everybody calls it the global financial crisis, but there was nothing global about it. It was a North Atlantic financial crisis. It was a financial crisis in which idiotic Europeans, I'm sorry, but, invested in the toxic securities. I mean, apart from Americans and the British, the Europeans invested in the toxic securities generated by the American financial system, and they suffered as a result. But everybody else, apart from suffering a sharp but short trade shock, sort of eventually, got up, dusted themselves off, and continued growing for quite a few years late. So in that sense, it was not a global financial crisis. And these terms encourage you to think you know something, when in fact you ought to be investigating its actual patterns. Where is FDI going? FDI is not going all over the world. Where are portfolio investments going, etc. You need to investigate the actual flows. What is the shape and form of them? When you use a term like globalization, it prevents you from asking all the right questions. Why do the global, why, and this is well before the hatred of globalism came along. That actually is simply, honestly, a result. I mean, to me, it's like my simple line on that is that Trump, what's interesting about Trump? Why did Trump win 2 elections? Because he figured out that you can no longer win elections by telling Americans that their economy is doing fine. He figured that out. But then, of course, because he wished to serve the same corporate capitalist class, except even a wilder wing of the corporate capitalist class than the normal ones, he then had to accompany this truth with a second lie. And the second lie was that your misery is because of trade, because of China, and because of immigrants. And so he encouraged this anti-globalism. But the thing is, it was never global in the first place. As lots of very interesting people pointed out, even back in the 90s and the 2000s, what passes for globalism is an increase in regionalization. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, why should you import something from 5,000 miles away when you can import it from 500 miles away? So, that's one thing. Other than that, I'll just say one thing, which is that, I find that you mentioned India in terms of its growth and so on. I really feel that I take very seriously the fact that, India right now has to be treated with a great caution. Its growth statistics, and economists who know better than me and are better statisticians than me have shown this, that its growth statistics are cooked. And if you actually looked at not cooked sounds bad, but they're based on certain faulty methodologies which have been adopted in about 10, 12 years ago. And these methodologies are exaggerating India's growth rate. And the primary problem, it seems to me, is that because they have, like all fascists, I'm sorry, but like all fascists, they destroy statistical capacity. So what they're doing is, instead of measuring actual economic activity, they are taking corporate activity as a proxy for the whole economy. But precisely this is a problem in a situation in which for the last 10 or 11 years, Modi government has prioritized the welfare of corporations above everybody else, so that the rest of the corporate economy is flourishing. Everybody else is suffering. And this is not a good economy. It is, in fact, a horrific economy. If you're one of the 3 to 5% of Indians who are doing okay, life's never been better. Everybody else is suffering. So, and there are no, at least in Brazil, you have like the PT. In India, we yet do not have such a force, which is a big problem. But okay, I'll end there.
Then I would ask maybe Jeff to quickly respond, and then anyone else who wants to add something or ask something.
Great. I'll be very brief. We have a lot to continue the discussion, but I have to go, and I think Radhika has to go also. So I'll be very brief. First, there was a finance minister in Chile under Pinochet who said, "I don't care whether we produce potato chips or computer chips. The market will determine that." Well, that's the wrong idea. We agree on that completely. Producing potato chips is not your way to success. Producing computer chips is a much better way to success, and that requires the state to play a role in this. That's number one. I think in the next round of discussion, I would add a lot more about the dynamics of innovation. China, for example, is an enormously competitive economy. They have had up to 400 electric vehicle producers. It's now being shaken down to perhaps a couple of dozen. But it's that competition, really a market competition, that has enabled China to come to the forefront of the world in electric vehicle production. Similarly in solar power and many other things. I do think that innovation is linked to market competition in an interesting way, and that state enterprises, which are a Walmart or a whatever, but run by the state, as a service provider and as a planner, probably misses something about the dynamism of innovation, which I take to be absolutely key in first the nature of advanced, a high-income economy like China or the United States, and a feature of the economic structure that the Soviet system, for example, did not generate, other than in the military sector, which was very specific, but it was not a broadly innovative society, but it was very successful in one narrow range, which it devoted an enormous amount of resources to the military-industrial complex. And I would link that to the question of living standards and so forth. Just to say 2 points that I want to agree on in closing. It's very important to understand that late industrialization came in the context of either a permissive or a negative force from the prevailing powers. So the growth of industry in East Asia in the 1960s was in a very permissive U.S. security environment for a number of smaller countries and for Japan. And when the United States opposed industrialization, it was able to absolutely harm a would-be late industrializer. And that goes back 200 years of the point that imperialist powers or dominant powers can frustrate countries that want their place in the sun. And this is very important, and it remains true until today. So I think that this is a very key point of analysis, which is completely overlooked by economists, by the way, in almost as a occupational, deep occupational trained failure. Everything about economic performance to neoclassical economics is about how you behave, not how anyone opposes you or supports you. And so failure means you're bad, whereas it could be you're killed from the outside. So I think this is extremely important. And then the final point on does the state control the corporations or the corporations control the state? In the United States, the corporations control the state. This is quite clear. It's really very Marxian, and it's very true. In the so-called Marxist state of China, well, it's whatever, maybe the socialist or the communist state, the state controls the corporations. If it leans too hard, it will do damage. So it is preventing the takeover of the state by some large tech companies, something like that. But it's been pretty deft at not crushing the private companies either. And I think that that's the skill. The skill is not to have a state governed by private companies, but also not to kill the private companies and their capacity to innovate. And I think China has done the best of this of all the major economies in the last 40 years.
Then thank you.
I just want to add one thing very quickly, because I know you have to go, but I've recently written a piece exactly on the issue of innovation, and I'd love to share it. It's not
Wonderful.
published yet, but I'm happy to share, because it's basically, the title says it all really, how DeepSeek exposed Silicon Valley's sci-fin-fi model of innovation. Sci-fi, but add finance to it. We've seen this movie before. It happened in the late 90s, and we're seeing it again. So this, I would like to poke a few holes. I mean, I don't disagree, about how China has innovated, but the Soviet Union also had many innovations to its credit. It was also capable of innovating. So there are different models of innovation, basically.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻。 抚平皱纹，超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。